This is Hello Brain, presented by Brainovation Network. Welcome back to Hello Brain. My name is Collin Adams. I'm your host, and today I'm joined by Dr. Ramona Von Leden and Dr. Dan O'Brien. Today we're starting a two-part series called Hello ADHD, where in the first episode we're going to be talking a lot about what ADHD actually is in the brain and how it manifests itself. And then in our second episode, we're going to cover a lot more of the different practical tools, regulation strategies, and systems that can be in place to better support an ADHD brain. So, I recently, the reason this really came up for me was I was at a Golden State Warriors basketball game, and as I was waiting in line to give my ticket to the ticket checker and get into the arena, there were two sets of parents, no kidding, directly in front of me in the line, who were talking to each other about this exact thing, talking about how they can better support their kids who have ADHD. They were asking questions like, should I go get medication? Should I bring them to the doctor? Should I go through the long diagnosis process? Or, what are the things that I can do and where do I go from information? And I think particularly with ADHD, it's been so difficult to understand. And so I'd love to really begin there. And Dr. Dan, I'll start with you. When we talk about ADHD, what's happening inside the ADHD brain that's different from a healthy brain?
Yeah, for sure, Colin. Great question. We know right now ADHD is a huge topic right now in brain health. And the fact that with an ADHD brain, they're, especially kids tend to be very impulsive. You have this lack of focus that's kind of occurring. Sometimes there's a lot of anxiety associated with that. So it's trying to get some of the kids, trying to get them very attentive, kind of locked in, so to speak. Sometimes they appear very almost like a brain fog or can be very aloof compared to someone else's brain. It's certainly, again, some clinicians think it's overdiagnosed. There's obviously a lot of therapies out there, the Adderalls out there that certainly can help. I'm certainly a big believer of, providing kids different resources to be very successful with the ADHD brain rather than just always therapies. There's other ways to really treat it, but I think it's just that inattentiveness, that lack of focus, the impulsivity. You have that dopamine, release, that dopamine spike a little bit. So they tend to be very hyper focused. They're very much into, things that are very excessive. It could be extreme skiing, extreme biking. Everything is kind of seems to be at times very extreme. So that's something that I've kind of noticed in patients with ADHD, and it's certainly, like I said, that it's a huge topic right now, and brain health, and it's something that has to be looked at very seriously because even as kids get older, there's a connection between that, with that dopamine spike, and of course we know that dopamine can be affected with Parkinson's disease as well. So there's that connection within that. So I think that if we can kind of catch this early upstream, provide especially these children with really good resources to be successful and create a really good learning environment, I think that's really key. But it has to be very looked at, has to be taken serious, and it has to be really, I think you have to give these children, an opportunity to be successful with various resources.
I would love to kind of dive in on this and get a little bit more into what's going on in the brain itself. Because Dan, while I think that's very much the presentation that most people see ADHD as, I actually don't think that it's a deficit of attention. I think ADHD really isn't a deficit of attention. It's a difference in how the brain decides when attention is worth focusing on something. Right? So novelty, urgency, competition are usually more exciting to an ADHD brain. And this all becomes back to the dopamine piece. It's how you're activating attention. Attention is driven by dopamine. It's all part of the motivation system in the brain. It's involved, right? It's neurotransmitter involved in motivation, reward, effort, and goal-directed behavior. So for someone who has an ADHD brain, the baseline dopamine signaling is lower in the circuits that connect specific brain regions, specifically the prefrontal cortex, the basal ganglia, the ventral striatum, and all of those are involved in like task initiation. So it all becomes about what's interesting to the brain versus what's priority based, right? Perhaps our world, the way we developed it, like there's a lot of things that we are asked to do throughout our day that are not exciting or interesting, but they have to get done. They are priorities. We have to do the dishes. We have to water our plants. It's not very exciting, but it has to get done. And so for I don't want to call it a typical brain because I really don't think that at this point there is a typical brain. I think there's variations of brain everywhere. We can get into that later. But for, let's say, one that's less motivation focused, somebody will say, okay, this task is important. I got to take care of it. I have to focus on it. Whereas someone who has ADHD is going to say, all right, this task is rewarding or interesting. I'll focus on that, but they don't with other things. And so that becomes a big purpose, so that when they finally find something that's interesting, which is why I liked your example of extreme sports, then the brain locks in extremely deeply because they're like, oh my God, this is exciting. It's fun. It's interesting. But when it's something that's more tedious, boring, mundane, it struggles.
There's no doubt. Do we think, Ramon, too, that there's a connection? Do you think it's more of a genetic or environmental? When we look at some of the etiologies, right, of what's really causing this, I felt like growing up, it wasn't a huge topic. And then progressively, when I did especially my psychiatry rotation, there was a lot of my child's psych, a lot of kids coming in with ADHD. And it seemed like it was being diagnosed very frequently with Adderall giving quite a lot to these kids. I'm curious your perspective. Do you think it's more of a genetic or more of an environmental thing that's really triggering it?
Right.
And now that we're seeing more of it, and I wonder why.
Yeah, I mean, my personal opinion, I actually don't think that this is something that we see more of now. I think we are more aware of it. I think it's something that Collin and I were chatting before we started the show today about how different generations learn. And I actually think that as technology has advanced and as we are seeing changes in the way that we provide information, in many ways, that is showing up more with ADHD brains because, and we'll get into this later, but for example, a lot of people who are in technology, who are entrepreneurs, who are creatives, tend to have that ADHD brain. And those are the people that go into things like, technology, building apps, etc. So a lot of our learning systems that we have now are actually somewhat more designed for ADHD brains, but that's not how we have things in our typical education system in the classroom. So it's not that the opportunities aren't there. I think it's just more that we're seeing it more because it's more in the ether. I don't know how best to say that.
No, you're absolutely right.
In terms of sort of the genetic components, the actual just development components, it's very interesting when you think about it this way. The ADHD system, there's two things that usually occur in an ADHD brain that lead to these processes. One is a slightly delayed maturation of the prefrontal cortex, and the prefrontal cortex having to do with impulse control, emotional regulation, decision making, right, working memory, or social interpretation. So the studies that are out on this suggest that the prefrontal cortex develops 2 to 3 years later on average for someone with ADHD. So that obviously plays into difficulty in an educational environment. And then there's also reduced regulatory system in the prefrontal cortex. Normally, that system is sending your calming inhibitory signals to your emotional centers, like the amygdala. But when that's weakened, your emotions can feel faster or stronger or harder to stop once they start. So the emotional responses for an ADHD person can be quite physical and not psychological. And I think Collin is nodding away while we're saying this, because I think that's all things that we see in the classroom. And and again, whether or not it's something that is actually more common, or if it's just we are recognizing those behavior patterns more, I think there's lots of educational differences that we understand now. Didn't mean that they were any less common 40 to 50 years ago. We just didn't have a name for them, right? There were certainly kids who were probably the kids who were disruptive, the ones who made jokes, the ones that were kind of the clowns. Those are probably the kids with ADHD. Also, those were often the boys. Boys already have a slower maturation of those regions of the brain. So then you add on that additional piece and it's going to be amplified.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Especially, I love your point around the school system, because you know what? I think that some of the classes where you sit down, you have to read and take tests and that kind of traditional. Now they're opening schools where I think, or at least programs are switching, where it provides more creativity, more hands-on, and that's perfect, I think, for the ADHD brain. And especially things like engineering or creative occupations where you don't have to sit down 8 hours a day and learn, take more and more tests. And I think that reset of the brain and creative ideas really helps. And I think that's a great way for ADHD brains to be, especially the kids, to be very successful in their occupation as they get older. And it's that creativity. You're right. It's recognizing it and then fueling that creativity in an appropriate occupation where it leads them to the most success.
Yeah, and you brought up the movement, which is perfect because that's something I had in my notes to discuss. Is in preparing for these segments, I kind of asked some friends who have ADHD. I'll be honest, I do not. That is not something I don't struggle with focus. It's lucky me, I guess. On the flip side, I also see like where there's benefits in the ADHD brain on the creative side. And across the board, when I ask my friends about this, how they manage it, because I have friends who are very successful in their careers. And I'm like, well, obviously you have to manage that difficulty in focusing in some way. It almost always was some kind of movement that they used to help them regulate it. Right. Kids have these fidget spinners, and a fidget spinner, although we find it annoying most of the time, is actually really helpful because it's enough of a movement that you're getting those dopamine spikes that you mentioned, Dan. So that it keeps the brain engaged in these little dopamine spikes while they're trying to deal with the mundane tasks. So although, to sort of the outside world, somebody's like, oh, these kids are fidgeting, they're kind of tapping their foot when they're thinking, they're moving around. That's actually just a coping mechanism to handle that lack of motivational reward, dopamine spikes.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's really interesting, especially with, I think, with these neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine. What do you think, Ramona, too, between this maybe connection, this dopamine connection between, I mentioned it earlier, this ADHD maybe progressing into something like Parkinson's later down the road due to those
Yeah.
low levels of dopamine? And I wonder if there's enough research out there to say that to be able to make that connection. We know in brain health, when we talk about MS, ALS, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, there's certain
Mm-hmm.
neurotransmitters, associated. I wonder if there's some sort of association with that low levels of dopamine, like I said, with Parkinson's and with ADHD. Would we see a
That
progression down the
that
road?
is, yeah, Dan, that's a fascinating question. I had never thought about that connection between Parkinson's and ADHD until you mentioned it today. I don't know if there's any study. Certainly interested to look now. But that is, in terms of certainly it's affecting similar systems. What I will say is what we do know with Parkinson's patients, oftentimes Parkinson's patients, movements and like getting into training programs can be one of the help best tools to manage their disease. And it does make sense because movement increases neurotrophic factors and neurochemicals that the ADHD brain also benefits from, right? So dopamine, serotonin, or norepinephrine is another one. Also in movement, you see BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor, goes up. All of those activate like the norepinephrine system, which increases alertness and attention, but it also helps to increase that dopamine availability, which is what someone with Parkinson's is lacking and needs. So there's certainly some crossover there. I don't know in sort of the medical field if there's anything on like a clinical study wise that showed any correlation between those two. I'd be very interested.
Yeah, no, I think not only that, and maybe Ramona, another thing I've often thought about is this idea of, people being on the spectrum, right, of ADHD and also maybe overdiagnosed. Do we have,
Mm-hmm.
you think, accurate ways to diagnose? And is there alternative treatments besides, looking at Adderall and some of these medications that are kind of obviously the chemical imbalances with some of the therapies that are occurring and the side effects? Do we have alternative methods, in brain health right now to be able to say, hey, we can really help these patients? Would it be through vestibular training or other modalities to say, hey, is there a way to reset the brain, for almost like these kids to step out of school for a quick break, step out of the classroom, come back in as they kind of
Mm-hmm.
reset their brain? I'm curious as to what the future holds in different training techniques, maybe therapies, maybe diagnostic tests to make sure we have a complete accurate diagnosis and it's not being overdiagnosed.
Yeah, I mean, I know in segment two of this, we're going to get into some of the therapeutic options that are out there beyond medication. And I've got like a whole list of things that I'm going to talk about when we get to that. But I do want to pause actually, Dan, and punt this back to Collin for a moment, because I think this would be, I mean, I am a little bit pessimistic in this sense that I doubt that there's really great testing tools for ADHD, but I don't have an experience in this space. So Collin, I'd love to hear what your experience was as a kid dealing with this. Like obviously you're an adult now who has a lot of perspective on what you've experienced, but did you think that there was a good way to
Yeah, I would say my experience, and I was undiagnosed all the way until I was 19 years old. So I think I lived most of my childhood and through my teenage years just thinking that I had a broken brain and that I was not going to be able to do well in school. I was going to struggle to learn. Every time I read a page in a book, I would immediately forget what I read. Little things like that, where I just contextualize my brain with shame and embarrassment and fear of the future, because if it didn't involve a sport, then I really just found that I couldn't engage at all. And when I did finally go through my very first assessment process, it was with my family care physician back home in Michigan. And we at the time, the gold standard was a multi-page questionnaire that I filled out that would kind of give voice to my symptoms and explain how much of maybe a symptom or an experience I had on a scale. And then from that, the doctor was able to make recommendations, typically on medications. And so from that, I got started on a medication, and we had to play around a little bit with the dosage at first. I think I started on one that might have been a bit too high, and then I worked my way back down. And what I noticed early on about the medication was that for me in particular, I had more side effects than I had results that I could tangibly notice. And part of that was I just had kind of an immature brain and approach to life as a 19-year-old. So I didn't really know how to recognize or pay attention to or be mindful of how something was affecting me a certain way. I just recognized that my sleep didn't feel very good. I kind of felt agitated from time to time, and I didn't eat as much. So I noticed those things more than I may have noticed how much it had been helping me. But then several months later, after being on medication for several months, I got connected through a family friend with a neuropsychologist who worked a lot in the cognitive performance space, which at the time was still kind of new and developing. And he was using technologies like neurofeedback and heart rate variability and heart brain coherence training to not just train the brain, but also assess it. And so that was where I really started to get to know myself and to know my brain better, was when I was able to see the electrical activity of my brain up on a screen in different ratios and in different regions of my brain. So now I was able to associate a symptom like brain fog or poor social skills with a specific number and region of the brain that I could train. And so at that point, it kicked in that athletic, competitive nature that I have so deeply. And I felt like I was really able to begin to take ownership of my process instead of feeling like I was buried in shame and that I was just always going to be this way. And it kind of ties to our conversation that we had about neuroplasticity, where you have to be able to believe that your brain can change, and it can change. And sometimes we just need the right tools and circumstances lined up for us to be able to start that process.
Colin, that's interesting. I think that also your experience of having the data in front of you is actually very in line with what coping mechanisms and regulation strategies most ADHD people use to actually organize their day, right? I think you described it as feeling kind of lost in the fog of all the different things. So here, if you are trying to figure out how to get more focused with your brain and you don't know where to start and you have that data in front of you, it kind of gives you a map to work it out, in the same way that you've talked about doing to-do lists and having like a very structured schedule in front of you where you don't have to try to figure that out on your own, which does seem to assist with managing ADHD a bit.
For sure. And I think that just in general, there are really two and maybe a third category of like the general experience of someone with ADHD. There's the inattentive, the hyperactive, and then sometimes people can kind of have a combo of both. And that's very general. Of course, everybody has their own unique brain and their symptoms and the way that ADHD might manifest as a symptom or as a circumstance will be different really for everyone. But the way that I experienced it, I like to explain kind of like a symphony orchestra, where you in ADHD across the board, you have a symphony orchestra up on the screen or up on the stage, and they don't have a conductor in both cases, hyperactive and inattentive. And in the hyperactive brain, there's no conductor controlling the sound and the direction of the music. So all of the orchestra members are playing their own song on their own instrument, and it just sounds like chaos. And a lot of times in the hyperactive brain, it can feel like chaos, like just intense chaos all the time. On the other side, and the side that I experienced more, was the inattentive side. It's the same without the conductor, but none of the orchestra members are playing anything. They're just sitting there staring off into the distance, and probably 10 of them forgot their instrument. So that's kind of the difference in how I like to give a voice to those two experiences, because it gives a picture, but also it just really helps to show that ADHD is not just this simple, like, ooh, squirrel experience for everybody, that it kind of often gets like watered down to. It's very complex, and it kind of lends itself to different struggles, of course, but then also some really incredible abilities when someone is really interested or engaged with something.
I wonder, kind of the follow-up question with that. I think this ADHD, one of the most fascinating parts to me is the emotional regulation component to it. In that, I think when we see these kids who are acting out, or we see someone who's having a difficult time focusing, we think of it as just them having lack of attention, but inside, that kid might be experiencing extreme emotional overwhelm, frustration when they can't express their thoughts, or flip side, intense excitement, enthusiasm, or feeling very rejected. And that really, the volume knob for their emotions is working much harder than it is in sort of the more neurotypical situation. And I really think that factors into the experiences you have in trying to manage it and trying to share that experience with other people. Did you find that? Did you find that as well, Collin?
Yeah, I did. And I think the best way I can explain it is just that, to say that I grew up in a family where we are all moderately intense. And like my dad and my sister can talk really fast and like boom, 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 have ideas come to head and then give voice to them. My mom is very similar in that way. And then there was kind of just me. And what often showed at the dinner table every night as disinterest or being disengaged from the conversation was really me internally being like, I can't keep up. Like, I have all these things that I want to say, and like, I really hope that eventually I can have the voice to say them. But whatever it was, there was this struggle between what I wanted to say and my ability to produce it into spoken word, if for lack of a better term. And that would often cause me in conversations to get frustrated, irritated, or disengaged. And so I was known as a kid to have this like monumental temper. And I wonder, kind of looking back, how much of that was just my own internal emotional battle and frustration of not being able to produce words and say what I wanted to say.
Oh my God, it's in like an Inside Out too. You were like the anger, but like just exploding.
Exactly. Yeah.
I
Just
cannot
like that.
imagine you. Like, I cannot imagine you with a giant temper. You are like the most even level person I've ever met.
Yeah,
You must have
totally
worked
agree.
really hard.
I have. It's been a
Hey,
lot
Colin,
that's
what
gone
would you
into this.
say to maybe parents listening, right? With if they have kids with ADHD, what's one maybe piece of advice that you would give these younger parents, right, with kids that are kind of, both parents are working, they're struggling to try to figure out, is it more of the parents trying to help provide the resources, or the education, the school system's coming together? What's maybe one piece you would say to those parents?
One piece. I could probably give like 50. But the
Or
biggest one
three,
is
right?
that,
What your top
Yeah,
three?
yeah,
let's go somewhere
yeah,
between 1 and 50.
yeah, right.
Yeah,
There's the ADHD extremes coming in. Yeah, I would
yeah.
say that my parents did a really, really good job with little to no understanding or resources or education on ADHD. Like I said, I wasn't diagnosed until I was 19, so they really had no idea. But my mom specifically did an incredible job of fostering an environment for me where I felt really just safe to be myself, and then found really fun ways to gamify the areas where I struggled. So one of those specifically was in second grade. I, we go back to the conversation of how school systems and the process for going through an 8-hour day is like completely ridiculous in my opinion. I would go to school and I'd sit there day after day. I would not really participate. I didn't show an interest in like showing initiative in class or being engaged with it. And so, of course, my teacher calls home and is telling my mom, like, yeah, Collin's not really participating. It doesn't seem like he's really interested in class. And I'm not really sure what to do. Maybe you could suggest something to him. And so my mom came up with this idea because she knew how deeply competitive I was, even at that young age. She said, okay, Collin, when you go to school, I want you to tally on a piece of paper how many times you raise your hand throughout the day. And based on the amount of times that you raise your hand, there will be a specific reward when you get home for the amount of times you raise your hand. And what her angle with that was to help me learn how to engage with class and to show initiative and to get involved with my learning process. For me, it was just like, screw learning. Like, I'm going to raise my hand so many times that my reward is like a new home for myself, something crazy,
Interesting.
or a big scoop of ice cream as a second grader. So she did a great job with that. Coming back to Dan's question, I think the biggest thing with ADHD kids is they don't, as a young kid, you don't have those tools or like the brain development or the resources yet to understand how to regulate yourself. That's something that has to develop and manage over time. I think that what my parents did really well that I can share also is before I would be like punished or rules would jump in, they would do things to help me regulate. And again, it's incredible that they knew this stuff, but like often, we had these conversations that would have to be had where I was acting a certain way and needed to be disciplined, and we would go walk somewhere else. And coming back to the idea of movement, movement really helps the ADHD brain regulate in a deep way. And so the fact that we were just able to separate from that current environment and situation where there was all that tension and emotional stuff going on internally, and to walk to a different environment to have this conversation, I think that really helped. Um, so it's really just finding ways to regulate the system before interjecting with anything else.
Especially for these, I think, upcoming parents, right? This new generation of parents that are struggling to try to identify ways. And what an admirable story that you provided, as well as the support you had from family.
So, Collin, then knowing that and the experience you had as a child, what do you do now to kind of structure your day?
I would say the last 2.5 years have been this extreme growth season for me, where I've really gotten to know myself and to know my brain, and to take the time to slow down and pay attention to how different things impact my brain and pay attention to my brain states. So that's been really important. And that all started, if we all go all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, that started when I first saw my EEG activity on a screen and I was able to relate with it in a new way. So that was a huge starting point. Now I work for a startup, I work from home. So those are two just like boom, boom, too much ambiguity. ADHD brain absolutely hates and desires ambiguity in the weirdest way. It's this strange relationship between the two where I know that I want novelty and I want things to change, but I also crave structure and routine. So how I do that is, you talk about different things like task initiation and task switching are very common routines that happen for everyone, regardless of whether you have a typical brain or if you have one that's more neurodivergent like mine. The biggest thing for me is that task initiation is always going to be a struggle, no matter what, because my brain just does not like to start. I can have all of the best intentions at the beginning of a day to start a project that I care about, but sometimes it's just really hard to get going. And so one thing that I'll do is create wins through movement. And I love, love, love to have a clean environment. So if I need to start something, I may just stand up really quick and go spend 5 minutes making my bed, because one, it satisfies that little OCD bug that I've got sitting in here somewhere. It creates a sense of achievement that I've done something, that I've initiated a task and I've completed it, and it's movement. So my brain is starting to get stimulated for a learning or a productive environment.
What are some small things that someone can do to support the ADHD brain? I think that's it. It's finding small tasks. And if you have a big project, really breaking those tasks up into tiny pieces so you get those little wins along the way versus just sitting down and being like, I have to, like, if you're doing something as simple as like, I've got to build a slide deck today. You don't sit down and build the whole slide deck. You say, all right, I've got to get the introduction slide done. And then you take a small break and, do some kind of little movement break, make a bed, make a cup of coffee, whatever it is, and then choose the next tiny win.
Yeah, I like to work in specific blocks. I call them flow blocks. It's kind of a buzz term in the world right now, where I only allow myself to work in 45-minute chunks. And then I give myself 15 minutes to literally just go bananas and do whatever. And I realize that that's kind of an atypical ability that I have throughout a workday. Not everybody has that same privilege to be able to work in that sense. But the way that I do it is if I have like task work or specific focus work, like building a PowerPoint presentation, like was your example a minute ago, I'll do it for 45 minutes. And then my 15-minute break will be heavy movement, a lot of that OCD, like cleaning up. Maybe I vacuum a bit, maybe I do the dishes, maybe I make the bed or whatever it might be. If my 45-minute block is more relational or social or being in a meeting or recording this podcast, then I typically will take that 15-minute break and just kind of sit with myself and be quiet, maybe use some of the technologies I have here for my brain to just kind of down regulate back to center, where movement may not help me in the same way to task switch as it would be to give myself a break and really allow my brain to rest. So I kind of use those two as the way to do it. But one thing that I've recognized over time is if I obey my own rule to go for 45 minutes and 15 minutes, I find that my mental energy and my bandwidth is much longer. So I'm able to work comfortably and focused all the way through the 8-hour day. If I don't follow my own setup, my own rule, and I maybe extend that 45 because I'm really invested in a task to an hour and a half or 2 hours, I find that, yeah, that might have been a really productive stretch, but now the end of my day gets shorter and I don't have the same clarity or focus or mental energy to do the tasks I had set up for later.
So
I
you
think
figure
that's
that
great.
almost reset then. The reset of the brain, Collin, is really key, right? You feel like you're having that reset.
Yeah.
That 15-minute break, I think, is crucial.
Yeah,
it is. And it's crucial for healthy brains and ADHD brains alike.
that's what I was going to say. I don't think that this is something that necessarily only works for ADHD brains. I think we all need to take breaks. I just recently ran a 2-day meeting and I planned the agenda very specifically where we were not sitting for more than maybe 90 minutes of like focus time. And then the next section would be something where it's more hands-on. It's you get up, you move around, maybe it's a conversation rather than a teaching moment. That's something I think kind of as a closer that I would like to mention in terms of, when I lecture or teach to a younger generation, I almost never think of it as a traditional lecture because I don't think that keeps people engaged. It's the conversation pieces. And so you have your moments where it's like, all right, I'm going to talk you through A, B, and C. We're going to discuss what this is. And then it's, what do you think about it? Get it, make it a dialogue. there's no right or wrong in those dialogues. It's just a way to make sure that people are getting those hits of dopamine so that they're not just kind of tuning out.
Yep. Yeah. And increasing the amount of movement that happens there. Like, I love a walk and talk, or even when I was like learning a skill. This is something that I found really helpful when I was a pitcher. I found that when I would walk side to side while I played catch with my throwing partner and have the same mechanics upper body, but I'm moving side to side, I would really lock in on that target. And the movement piece helped me to stay fluid, not just from a brain perspective, but also a skill development perspective.
That's really interesting, Collin. I've done some work actually with some professional athletes, and I'm wondering, Collin, do you think that the ADHD brain, they're actually better athletes? You know, with your incredible baseball background, is there something to be said with that hyper focus, that locked in, that could almost make them more successful athletes?
I think that there can be. There is this ability. We talk about interest-based attention versus importance-based attention. Interest-based attention is heavily involved in the ADHD brain, whereas maybe a more typical brain would be importance-based attention. Like, you have a task at work, and so you do it regardless of if you're interested. Whereas ADHD, you have to be interested. Otherwise, it's really a no-go unless you set up structures and systems for yourself to do that thing. With sports, it takes a profound amount of intensity and commitment to become a professional athlete or even a college athlete. And that's where being ADHD can actually be an advantage, is because your brain has a specific ability to really lock in on something and close other things out. And that might have been my experience. I definitely was more willing to be disciplined and follow through on my baseball activities than I was really anything else. It's funny, you often meet or interact with a professional athlete and you come out of the conversation, and not always, but sometimes is the case. You're like, wow, they were a bit odd. That was strange. And I think it kind of takes being a bit odd to make it to that level in any field, but like in sports in general.
I totally agree. I think it takes a special kind of someone, and it might be someone who's ADHD, or it could be someone even on the other end of the spectrum. Let's just leave it that way, because you have to have a level of dedication and focus, like, that just goes above and beyond the average.
Absolutely. And so kind of as we close the show today, I'm really excited in our next episode to start to talk about the specific things and practical steps that people could listen in and begin to do, whether it's with themselves. Many people self-report that they have ADHD. Many people have been diagnosed, or they're caring for someone who has it. Maybe it's a child or a friend that they want to be more supportive of. So I'm excited to get into that conversation coming up. Thank you all so much for joining. This has been Hello Brain. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Hello Brain, presented by Brainovation Network.